Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, wherever you are in the world. And welcome to this week's edition of the Thursday Talk webinars on DME for Peace. My name is Jack Farrell. I'm the DME for Peace project manager at Search for Common Ground. I'm going to be your host today. Now, I think everybody online is very aware of the upcoming US presidential election. And as we look toward November, which is a fractious and potentially dangerous political moment, we're asking, what might peace builders learn from the experiences of countries that have dealt with contentious elections? Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ashley Quarcoo, who is a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and my colleague, Mike Jobbins, who is the Vice President of Global Affairs and Partnerships at Search for Common Ground, and they're going to lead a discussion on contentious elections, political violence, and challenges to democracy, lessons from around the world. Now, I know there are a lot of new people joining us today, so as an overview, today's webinar will be split between the presentation and moderated discussion with the entire audience when we open up for your contributions. If you have a question during Ashley and Mike's presentation, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A. Now, Mike and Ashley, it's really exciting to have you join us. Ashley, feel free to take it away when you're ready.
Great, thanks so much. I'm going to begin the presentation by providing some framing on the nature of the challenge. And then I'm going to discuss some of the global democracy support approaches that have been deployed in similar situations. And then I'll hand it over to Mike, who will do the same from a peace building and violence prevention perspective. So can we just go to the next slide? So as we think about our global experience, there are usually about 5 key places that elections tend to go awry. First, the formulation of the voter list and verification of the voter list is a critical piece of voter enfranchisement, and if it's poorly managed or deliberately undermined, can sink the credibility of an election and in some cases incite violence. Campaign events also, they attract strong partisans in support of a particular candidate, but they also may attract, in some environments, protesters from the other side, or in the cases where opposition parties may be holding events, campaign events, those might be shut down by the state security apparatus. Voting day operations, also a critical part of how voters perceive the credibility of an election, their experience in how long they have to wait in lines, whether they can find their name on the list, how well the voting technology works. Counting, tabulation, results test transmission. An election could go awry during any of these processes, especially when there are discrepancies between results or delays in the announcement of results. Delays can lead to information vacuums, misinformation, and premature declarations of victory. And finally, disputes and appeals can take place in the formal election dispute resolution system, but they can also take place outside of that system, and they might show up in protests and counter-protests and in incidents of violence. So in the next slide, I want to just point out that not only are we just many of the challenges I articulated in on the previous slide describe what we've seen globally in contentious environments, and certainly many of those challenges apply to the moment in the United States. But I think it's also important to call attention to the impact that COVID is also having on elections in this time. And there have been a number of countries in the last 6 months or so that have conducted elections, and we can see a little bit about how elections have been impacted in those places. First, we've seen low voter turnout in most countries, everywhere from West Africa, Benin, over to Europe and France, where officials there wanted to delay their first round municipal elections to try to increase voter turnout. There's also been a big impact on election observation. International observation has been limited in some cases due to travel restrictions. In other cases, it's been used by incumbent governments to limit oversight, like in the case of Burundi. We've also seen major strains on election administration as election management bodies try to both ensure public safety as well as a credible election process. And in some places, they are also doing both of those things while introducing new technology for voter registration and for voting. And finally, there's a lot of changes to election timelines as officials decide whether to delay polls in order to get that time to prepare, to try to wait out the virus, etc. So if I go to the next slide, I'm going to sort of pivot now to think about what are the global approaches to election support and violence prevention that we've seen in the collective experience of the field around the world, and how those might respond to some of the challenges outlined that could play out in the U.S. I'm going to focus my comments on the election support, the sort of traditional election support field, and then I'm going to hand it to Mike to focus on the violence prevention aspects. So I'm going to talk about 5 key interventions or approaches that could help address some of these challenges. First is around election administration, a really common general election support intervention. In the United States, research, at least as late as 2014, shows that more than any other variable, election administration is the most important in determining how American voters perceive the legitimacy of an election. And that means having well-functioning equipment, making sure that voters have no difficulty verifying their presence on the rolls, the waiting times to vote, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is obviously something globally that we often invest in to support the administration and the operations of voting. But I think we also, in these contexts, can invest in a particular area that can also often be a flashpoint, which is the construction and formulation of a credible voter list, both to ensure that all eligible voters are able to participate and also to prevent fraud. And one important way that we do this globally is to support some kind of public vetting of the list. So this photo shows the process of in 2015 in Myanmar, where the list was publicly posted multiple times so that voters could come and check their name, make corrections, etc. And there are signs in some parts of the US right now of a move toward this kind of public vetting of voter lists. For example, this year in Ohio, state officials released a list of 235,000 voters that it had planned to purge, and it released this list for review to independent civil society organizations for the first time. And the independent review of these groups, these civil society organizations, helped to prevent about 40,000 names from being wrongfully purged from the list in Ohio. The next common area of intervention, just go to the next slide there, is voter civic education. Obviously, this is a critical area. Obviously, often a huge part of an election support program is to help voters understand the when, the where, the how to vote. And that's obviously a bigger need in a context when that information is changing and when there's a lot of misinformation about some of those questions out there. It's important to think about educating around all phases of the process, everything from the registration requirements to the voting process itself, and what to expect after votes are cast. How will the votes be counted and under what timeline? When will official results be announced? Where can I find the information that I need? So in Kenya, for example, in the 2017 election, the civil society, engaged in lots of different tactics to educate voters about some of these questions: radio and television placement, social media, door-to-door canvassing, and they selected those methods based on analysis of the voter education needs in advance of the election. So they're able to use that analysis to help inform the types of approaches that they would use. So let's go to the next slide and talk about another important approach, which is independent election observation. Already mentioned that this has been really impacted by COVID, but in normal circumstances, observers play a really critical role in explaining what is supposed to happen during each phase of the election process for the public. And they also can articulate for the public in real time where each phase is meeting international standards and where there are shortcomings or shortfalls. This is a picture of observers observing the tallying process in Sierra Leone. But observers, can often start way before that in terms of helping voters to understand what's happening in the pre-election environment, the conduct of voting itself, and then tallying and counting, as well as events in the post-election period. So they help to manage public expectations about what should happen during each of those phases. They can also play an important role in terms of mapping election risk. So on the right there, you'll see a color-coded map that was produced by a civil society organization in Colombia during their 2014 elections. This group frequently produces this kind of election risk mapping to identify where the most vulnerable areas for fraud and for violence, and to deploy their observers accordingly. And so you'll see the color-coded shading there of what they determined to be the various levels of risk. They were able to deploy, in this case, about 11,000 observers to the most risky or vulnerable areas around the country. The next area, going to the next slide there, is inter-party dialogue. This is a lesser, I think, less common kind of intervention, but these are institutional mechanisms for political actors that can be used to discuss a wide range of issues, including longer-term democracy and peace-building items, but they can also be important platforms for dealing with short-term issues like a code of conduct for elections, for example. But these platforms, because they exist as an ongoing institutional structure, they create a space for problem solving between parties, ideally before the problems escalate, or in some cases after there has been a violent episode. So the Center for Multi-Party Democracy in Kenya is one example of the latter. There are, just a quick note on the party code of conduct front, there are a lot of problems with codes of conduct. They are voluntary instruments. Most of the time, the costs for parties or candidates to break the code are pretty low, and so they definitely have a lot of problems. This picture is an example from one that was just signed in February in Guyana. But I do think they can be useful for a couple of purposes. One is that they establish some norms for the expected behavior of parties and candidates, which can be effective, most effective when those desired behaviors are spelled out very clearly. And secondly, they can create some limited accountability for breaking those norms, either because voters look at that behavior and may respond accordingly at the ballot box, or because there is some kind of enforcement mechanism by an election management body or other mechanism that may produce some kind of monitoring report or even impose fines. The last area for the democracy support interventions I'll touch on is the election dispute resolution. And this is really the investments that we make in supporting the various courts, tribunals, and other institutions that may have to handle disputes across the pre-electoral, electoral, and post-electoral period. And when we know that there's likely to be lots of different disputes in a contested election, investing in these dispute resolution institutions can be quite important, both in terms of handling the volume of cases that may come to them, training them on the relevant laws and regulations, and on kind of strategic messaging and communication with the public. So I'll now hand it over to Mike to discuss some of the violence prevention interventions.
Thanks a lot, Ashley. And before I should start, I'll say, I'll be sharing some experiences from various elections that I've followed closely, both in my role with Search for Common Ground and without it, outside of it. At the same time, the opinions and the perspective are my own and not necessarily searches. And to build on Ashley's comments, of course, the number one feature that determines how violent or disruptive a political process will be is the underlying integrity of the process itself. And the aim of elections is about choosing leaders, is about moving a society forward, it's about running a high integrity process, not about exclusively preventing violence and managing conflict. However, the reality is that elections have been the scene of conflict and political violence around the world. And I wanted to highlight four kinds of interventions and lessons the US might draw, looking at the media, the role that early warning, early response plays, security management throughout the election cycle, and then some of the wider questions that many in American society are grappling with around polarization and politics and identity. I'd like to share, there's a photo from Madagascar, but I'd like to share an experience from Guinea, a country in West Africa where, like many places around the world, where you live, your ethnicity and your social class had a very deep impact both on who you voted for, how you voted, and what kinds of media you consumed. Every election cycle in Guinea has been marred by contestation and disputes over the outcomes, large-scale protests, and often deaths. In that context, the Guinean media came together. They created something called the Synergy of Medias, where 69 radio stations created a joint newsroom, broadcasting nationwide on almost every platform to every community, regardless of ethnicity or political tendency, covering the election process, the mechanics of voting, documenting the dispute resolution process, and creating a common narrative for that 90% of the Guinean public tuned into, explaining what was going on, not in the aim of preventing disputes or resolving them per se, but ensuring that everyone had access to similar sort of rules of the game and the similar fact pattern. Obviously, the American media environment is quite different from Guinea's in terms of level of development. But I think there are two lessons that Americans can take. The first is that the US has benefited for perhaps several decades of a relatively homogenous media environment with 4 or 5 major national broadcasters, with national newspapers. But now over the course of maybe the past decade, increasingly targeted news channels, algorithm-generated content through social media and so forth, have created an opportunity for Americans to learn from others about how more tumultuous and diverse and filter-bubbled media environments have handled elections and particularly handled election disputes. And one of the first lessons is actually highlighted the role that dispute resolution and observation can play. But one thing that we learned in Guinea is that after the dispute has occurred, it's a terrible time to begin explaining to the public what observers are, what the dispute resolution process is, and particularly as things are changing with COVID and election mechanics themselves are differing. The degree to which media are able to explain to the public the role of political party observers and political party analysts and partisan analysis, the role and who are doing independent analysis, is incredibly important so that everyone enters election day with a common rule, a sense of the rules of the game. And then the second is understanding, is building those kinds of abilities. And in the U.S., there are still a large number of channels that have strong followings across different regions and political tendencies, and reinforcing those kinds of those channels and messages, and using them to pass messages and drive a wider national narrative. The second example I wanted to point to is around early warning and early response. That means sort of identifying where there is risks of violence and acting quickly to mitigate them. In Nigeria in 2015 was an incredibly high risk elections, recognized, I think, by almost every Nigerian. You had a weakening at that time incumbent in terms of his political popularity, large-scale social protests, deep questions about the country's crisis management capacity, and high levels of violence throughout the country. And the understanding, the intuitive understanding of the risks across Nigerian life led to a number of relatively remarkable steps in terms of preparedness for managing what was a relatively contentious process. The first was at the diplomatic level and sort of at an international level. There was quite a lot of scenarios planning. I think there were 16 scenarios that were developed with key Nigerian as well as international stakeholders, looking at a number of low probability, high impact events, leaders not conceding, local and national elections going awry, assassinations, and there were several attempts during the process, various scenarios involving protests turning violent. All of in that focus at a global level on the risks and a dry-eyed analysis of where things could go wrong was incredibly important for both for getting different actors on the same page, but also to have an agreed-upon playbook across actors should God forbid they ever be needed. The second was that a number of Nigerian actors who were not particularly partisan or partisanly aligned, including popular musicians and movie stars, the chambers of commerce at a local level, media owners and investors, were seized with the stakes and understood the risk of things going wrong and the role that they, as actors with a long-term influence, could play in moving things forward. And I think often in electoral context, there's a focus on dialogue and negotiations between partisan actors, in the American context, perhaps Democrats and Republicans or conservatives or liberals or however you view it. But in many cases, including in Nigeria, one of the determining factors was not the relationship between the already deeply aligned political interests, but rather the role of new influential actors pronouncing themselves and articulating a greater vision to those actors and laying out a capacity. And so I'd recommend, and I think one lesson Americans can take is the importance of, perhaps at a more elite level, the importance of some of those other actors who are not as yet partisanly aligned in shaping the conversation, and particularly in managing potential crises. And the third is, this is a photo from a meeting held in the divided city of Jos in the center of the country. But there was a concerted effort in the 6 months before the elections and to build up the social capital, the relationships between Christians and Muslims, between activists of different parties, and between peace-building organizations with the capacity to de-escalate situations, particularly in places that had experienced political violence in the past. And that investment established the networks and the relationships that would be needed, again, God forbid, and as they were, needed to mobilize and de-escalate emerging situations. The third example, the third sort of aspect I wanted to focus on is security management. Ashley alluded to the challenges of managing protests, counter-protests, mass mobilization. That's a challenge in almost every society. And I wanted to point to the example in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Their most recent elections were, many observers considered them to be deeply flawed. They were marred by large degrees of protest and many deaths. Still, the levels of violence differed quite significantly around the country. One of the reasons, as we looked, is that the degree of preparedness for managing security crises had a deep capacity to influence the outcome in the end, and the level of violence that surrounded protests and counter-protests that managed large-scale social movements. And the Democratic Republic of Congo, like the US, has multiple security forces, from sort of federal police to local police to military to Republican Guard and so forth. Same as in the US, there's National Guards, there are local police, state police, in many cases there are federal police law enforcement forces deployed. And the degree to which mayors and civil society actors, so civilian actors with deep ties to the community, were able to lead their own security management and crisis management plan, including identifying, building relationships with the security forces, and also identifying which of the multiple security forces were the most appropriate to intervene. Help to build trust, but also just like any security force has different degrees of mandate, different degrees of capacity, and is in some cases seen by the population as aligned with one or a different political interest. The role of local civilians, of both civil society and sort of elected officials, in identifying a plan and in choosing and involving security, but also choosing sort of who are the lead agencies. In the US, for example, what the role of the National Guard is or is not, can play a key role in shaping the election outcome, the violence outcomes of larger scale social protests and other kinds of security situations. And then finally, and I'll stop here, elections are, we know very deeply, elections are only a moment in time occurring against a wider social backdrop, and that's very much the case in the US as almost everywhere in the world. I think the good news is that we have pretty, and in the US as elsewhere in the world, a personal identity, a political identity, and sort of opinions on, and political opinions are very closely linked. In some ways, to many Americans, I would say it feels even more closely linked than ever. The good news is that societies around the world that are much more deeply divided than the US have navigated these and swum in these muddy waters before. And we have a pretty good sense over the medium and long term of what kinds of things are effective at decreasing polarization and managing political conflict over the medium term. Three that I'll highlight quickly, and then I'd love to hear from others in question and answer and discussion. One is that this is a photo from Sierra Leone, and we've been doing some randomized control trials, so deep scientific programming on the effectiveness of voter information and civic education. These are candidates who are having the first ever rural debates in rural Sierra Leone. And we found that after being exposed to the platforms of candidates, people were 9% more likely to vote for a different candidate based on just an exposure to the platform and the issues that they cited as their priority issues. So we know to some extent, although those are great stereotypes about people who will vote for one party or another, regardless of platform, regardless of their personal interests, but that's not always empirically the case. And many times, absent information, people will rely on other kinds of signals, whether ethnic identity, political party affiliation, and so forth, in terms of the candidate they choose, and that there is an effect on cross-party voting or cross-identity voting when people have more information. The second is we know that social impact entertainment can have a profound role of shaping a social life. We've seen that in the U.S. context, the way that Will and Grace shifted attitude, a popular sitcom shifted attitudes to LGBT, or before that, The Jeffersons, a popular sitcom about an African-American family, shifted attitudes among white Americans. So we know that social impact entertainment can have a huge impact around the world as we imagine the other, as we imagine how societies might be and imagine the perspectives of one another. In the context where the majority, more than 50% of all dramas on American television are cop shows, the role that those kinds of platforms can play in shaping people's attitudes towards police authority and conflict management more generally can be profoundly impactful. And then finally, many of the issues at the end of the day, both Search for Common Ground and others come from the perspective that the conflict is a natural and normal part of human life, and debating and disagreeing profoundly over weighty and serious issues are really the only way that society can progress. And so there's nothing inherently wrong with the discomfort that many of us feel in disagreeing with one another on important issues, but often there's a lack of, in particular as technology changes, as societies change, there's often a challenge in building the level of comfort, the skills for engaging in deep, meaningful, and profound disagreements that lead towards a wider consensus. We've seen both, in any number of societies, the role that conflict resolution training, the role of negotiations, mediation, facilitation training have had in raising people's own comfort levels, but also the way that they've influenced media hosts, that they've influenced political leaders to lead the kinds of tough conversations that every society needs to have, and certainly the U.S. is no exception to that. So I'll stop there on that note, and I'd really look forward to answering questions and participating in this wider conversation with the community.
Great, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you, Ashley, for a great presentation. I know you've given me a lot to think about. I know our audience are eager to ask you a lot of questions. Yeah, Mike, just on the last point of polarization, I think it's incredibly challenging given the current media environment that we have, you know, that anger sells. Right now, I'm reading Ezra Klein's Why We're Polarized, and he makes a great point about, you know, the most effective politicians actually thrill their supporters, but they do so in the context of the threat their opponents pose. So he's saying that, you know, you don't just need support, you need anger. And I think that's where we're entering a dangerous moment. To our audience, now is your time to shine as we open up today's presentation to your questions. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday Talks. You can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, where you can type your question. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, which will allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. Just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace's media gallery, so those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the wider discussion. So we have a ton of questions, guys, and as you can imagine, they're coming from a wide spectrum of people, from election observers in Burundi to the DRC to people in the US. But our first question comes from Colonel Pratt, who is at George Mason University. And Colonel Pratt has asked, what is at stake globally for the United States as a champion of the democratic process if the November election results in widespread election chaos?
I think that's an excellent question. I'd be curious to hear Ashley's perspective as well on the democracy and governance side. But I would highlight that, you know, every election is imperfect, and in many cases, America struggles in the 60s with racial inequality. Even more recently, the way that discussions about race in America have informed conversations around the world. Polarization, political tensions, competition, escalated conflict over public affairs is not a uniquely American phenomenon, and it's not in not having problems that America can inspire others. It's also in how Americans choose to manage them, what's learned from the experiences, and how America and American society swim through these muddy waters. That also demonstrates potentially America's leadership, but also creates a fruitful example for colleagues dealing with similar issues in societies around the world. And so I think it's dangerous to assume that America can achieve its leadership position by dint of being more enlightened than any other society. Rather, leadership also comes through making mistakes, learning from mistakes, sharing with all humility one's experiences with the wider world.
Ashley, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I couldn't agree more.
Great. Mike, this next question is directed towards you, and it comes from Amanda Ripley, who's a journalist. And Amanda writes, thank you, Ashley and Mike, for this important and pragmatic conversation. Mike, I'm wondering, what did the nonpartisan Nigerian actors say or do in advance of the election that seemed to be helpful?
Yeah, there were a number of things. For example, major media artists, famous singers who were not known to have particular political ideologies, led very public campaigns asking for along the message that elections are not war. The sense that, you know, this is not a moment for winner takes all attitudes. The media publishers, many people pay attention to the journalists, for example, but the role of media publishers dedicating a significant amount of space in their publications to a sober discussion of the risks, not only of violence, not necessarily fear-mongering way, but in helping move a society to understand that that there are really real risks of things going off the rails are two things that were quite influential. And then, although it's much more of perhaps a back channel, and I don't have as much insight on some of the things that are more public, but the role that local chambers of commerce played in particular in engaging in some of those security management conversations that I described in the Congo example, but similarly in Nigeria, in communicating with local officials, communicating with security officials, their own strong interest in seeing processes managed without violence, and seeing, in their interest in, economic and otherwise, in the well-being of the communities where they had invested, I would argue played a pretty significant role as well.
Great, thank you, Mike. Our next question comes from Rachel Brown from Over Zero. And Rachel writes, we've been doing work on the narrative and early warning and response pieces here in the US. Something I've been wrestling with in terms of how we can bring international experience to the US is specifically around the security management piece, especially in communities where the relationship with police is particularly challenging and where we've seen the use of force against civilian protesters with impunity in the past few months. Are there any lessons you would point to from places with low trust between civilians and security forces, but also where security forces pose a particular risk of violence? What are other options beyond the civil society work we've already discussed?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are three elements, and then Ashley, please jump in from your experience. I think there are three sort of key elements. One is around preparedness. In some cases, there is violence committed as a result of distinct policy, at least in our experience, as a result of distinct policies, either erroneous or malicious. At the same time, where situations become get out of hand, it creates some new opportunities for ill-disciplined, just poor responsiveness. So the first is that there's a significant amount of investment that can be made within the security forces, within police and so forth, in preparedness. And right now, in the U.S. context, I think it's relatively foreseeable that there'll be large-scale social mobilization in the period throughout, around the elections. In that kind of context, I think anywhere in the world, we would say, many people would say it would be irresponsible for security agencies not to be planning that. But the second, what I would focus on is, the role of municipal and civilian leadership in articulating which security forces are best to intervene in building those kinds of relationships. We've seen, for example, in northeastern Nigeria, when Search began working there, the Nigerian security force had a 4% approval rating, which is, very, very low, and perhaps even lower than almost any part of the U.S. And similarly extremely high levels of reported abuse. And what we found was that even if the general attitudes for security forces were low, the degree to which civilians were attitudes towards individual security forces, so police versus army versus, in that case, the drug enforcement agency versus the traffic controls, were quite different. And so the degree to which civilians are mapping out, even if there's not a general distrust for the security forces, are there some that you trust? Are there some agencies, are there some individuals, some units that have a relatively good track record, and begin working with those? I mean, I think in this context, that's another perspective, and particularly, I live in Washington, D.C., where there are multiple agencies that they all have jurisdictions in different ways. The degree to which each of those agencies is involved in managing contentious processes is something that can be decided with participation from those agencies, but also something that municipal authorities and others can play a big role in articulating what are the kinds of agencies, which agencies and which units are the ones that should be best positioned as forward-facing in the community. And then the last I would just say, point to, is that in highly escalated, stressful situations is a terrible time to make friends. And I don't know the degree to which there's active community outreach, not across the country, but the degree to which people who are actively engaged and likely to be engaged in social mobilization and social protest, those are key people to have a relationship with from the security forces perspective, but also now is a time for organizers, potentially, and activists of all stripes, to begin establishing relationships, the kinds of relationships that would be needed should we enter a moment of increased, or should America enter a moment of increased social friction and tension.
And I just want to add one more thought, which is tying on to Mike's point about building the relationships now and also preparedness. And I think one way to kind of do both is to think about how do you build a common understanding across the security and the civilian and the political stakeholders in a jurisdiction, in a community, about what the risks are, or what the kind of sort of analytical underpinnings of that are going to help guide your response might be. And sort of getting a common understanding across those various stakeholders is one way to both build that trust and also help everybody kind of be on the same page about what then the plan should be if and when some of these scenarios do play out.
Great, thank you, Mike and Ashley. We have a raised hand from Gregory Simpkins, and Gregory, I know you have submitted your question in writing, but I'm unmuting your microphone, so please feel free to ask Mike and Ashley your question live.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. In observing elections in Africa over a period of time, I've noticed that violence against voters at the polling place or on their way to the polling place was a political tactic, since a lot of the voters were women, often carrying small children with them. Now, obviously, if the government and the law enforcement is behind that, they're not going to protect these people. So would both of our speakers recommend that there be some specific mechanism set up either by women themselves or civil organizations, faith-based groups, to protect women, maybe going in groups with some protection so that they feel safe to vote? Otherwise, you're going to continue to have people who are afraid to go and cast their ballot. Unfortunately, that seems to be a possibility here as well. So in your answer, you might want to look at not just developing countries like in Africa, but also here in the States. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really important tactic. All of these kinds of ways that voters can be diverted from the polling place or intimidated away from showing up in the first place. I do think that that's why having observers can often be a critical part. Those eyes and ears on what is happening and the documentation that goes along with it can both help provide remedy in real time as observers alert officials higher up to some of these problems, or it can alert local politicians, security actors, et cetera. And I also think that some of the other strategies around the groups that are mobilizing voters to participate in terms of coming in groups and providing that added sort of protection of especially for women who may be more vulnerable. But this is why the U.S. doesn't have a broad history of election observation, at least from domestic groups, and I think this would be like a sort of important area to explore in terms of how to provide more eyes and ears over what's happening, because it's much harder. It's a huge deterrent when we see violence happening at the polling place. It's a huge deterrent once there are more eyes and ears on what is happening at local polling places.
I think the only thing I'd add to Ashley's comments, I think in addition to the and to Gregory's question, in addition to the attacks on voters, we've seen intimidation in many places, rumors of attacks, rumors of what would happen once you step into the booth, who would be there, what the process would look like, and the degree to which media, particularly because in many places the rules are changing as a result of COVID, can explain not only having It's important, as Ashley says, to have observers. It's also important to let everyone know that they're observers. It's important to know to explain to people what resources are available, and to ensure that there's adequate and accurate reporting. If God forbid events do, there is violence on election day, ensuring that that's being accurately reported, but also in a way that's not further creating fear and the kinds of intimidation that many state but also non-state groups look to create through those kinds of attacks.
And I think just one other point too is that it's important to try to deter and prevent that kind of thing, but it's also important to document it when it does happen. And that's another reason, again, to have some of these eyes and ears there that can help create the record for these kinds of violations. It's important to inform how we assess the quality of the process. And it's also important for any kind of accountability that may need to be put in place for those violations so we can deter it the next time.
So I recognize we're at time, but I want to make just a bit of time for a last question targeted at you, Ashley. And this question comes from Ryan White at FHI 360. And he says, do you think the system in the US where individual states are responsible for setting voting deadlines, requirements, etc., plays a role in public distrust about election integrity, especially in swing states where they may not live?
So I think that, I've talked to election officials, administration officials in other countries who sometimes will come here as a part of election observation programs to sort of observe our elections. And they always express, surprise at, how different jurisdictions handle elections. It's very different. The equipment is different. The voter ID requirements, sort of what you have to do when you show up, is different. And they express surprise at that, and also the fact that people accept it or seem comfortable with it. And I think that it's only recently that sort of this erosion of trust in the elections process has really broad trust. I will say that there are obviously communities, especially in the African American community, that have had deep trouble with accessing those rights. So I don't want to ignore that ongoing challenge. But I think that the general erosion of trust in elections in the U.S. has been a more recent phenomenon, and I think it's more it's less related to the sort of large decentralization of election administration than it is to the sort of political rhetoric, which has, I think, which has sort of pointed people to sort of sow those doubts in people's minds. There's certainly problems. We have election interference, we have voter suppression and other kinds of problems, but in general, the quality of an election is in large part related to how much people trust the process. When people trust the process and the process has the oversight to demonstrate that it does have credibility and legitimacy, then those elections generally go off okay. But when people start to distrust the process, then and doubt and fear and suspicion sort of start to become the overriding attitude, then that creates a more contentious environment in which to have elections. And I think, unfortunately, that's the direction that the U.S. has gone off into.
Actually, thank you very much for such a detailed answer. And with that, I think we're just about finished for today. We have received, I think, over 70 questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all, but I will make sure that every person that attended today's webinar is sent a copy of the recording. We have a discussion feature on DME for Peace, so please feel free to continue the discussion in the comments, and we'll make sure that this is sort of a fruitful learning opportunity for everyone who joined. A big thank you to Mike and Ashley for your presentation and leading today's discussion. I know some of the questions are really difficult. I know it's a very broad and contentious topic, but you guys did an absolutely wonderful job. And thank you to our audience for joining today's webinar. As I mentioned, the recording will be posted online on our media gallery later today, so please feel free to return to it and share it with your colleagues. As there are many new faces and names attending today's webinar, if you are interested in more content like this and participating in the biggest webinar series in the peace building field, the link to register for the DME for Peace mailing list is in your chat box right now, and you can join us every week. We'll be back with another Thursday Talk webinar in a not too distant future, and look forward to seeing you all online again soon. Look out for each other, take care, and stay healthy. Thanks again, Mike and Ashley.